Hi, and welcome to the Business of Story. I'm Park Howell, and I'm really excited on this particular show because I have started a brand new journey in my life. Well, Michelle and I have. After, 3 decades of living in Phoenix, Arizona, we finally finished our home in northern Arizona, a place called Munns Park, which is about 15 miles south of Flagstaff. We bought a little lot on a lake up here about 9 years ago. We designed a home and we've been working on starting it, construction-wise over several years. And we actually began about 2 years ago. We had a contractor up here said it'd take 6 to 8 months. I said, oh yeah, probably more like 10 months, I'm guessing. Well, it's been nearly 2 years. They call it building on mountain time. And I've never experienced anything quite like it. I was always raised to do what you say you are going to do, and I just haven't found that with the contractors and the subcontractors up here, with the exception of a couple that have really delivered. But I'm not here to whine and complain about it. I'm just here to say, we finally got in. And I've got my new studio here. I'm still trying to work out the kinks in the technology. In fact, it's kind of echoey in here, so it might sound a little bit different to you. And of course, Wi-Fi being in the remote area of northern Arizona is always a little sketchy too. But it's coming together, and this is my very first show coming to you from northern Arizona. One other addition of the Business of Stories, our son, Caden Howell, who lives in Las Vegas. Cade graduated from the Conservatory of Recording Arts and Sciences in Arizona a couple years ago, and he's a studio audio producer. And he's got his own live Twitch show and does all kinds of amazing work in audio. And he's now producing my show for me. So I record this, drop it up online. He gets it. He pieces it all together, makes it sound wonderful. And I'm just so proud and happy to have Cade a part of the Business of Story team. So hats off to you, Cade. I salute you. All right, now let's jump into this show because it's a really fascinating topic around story structure, brain structure, the use of metaphor. And we have a very special guest coming to us today from my old hometown. And I'm not talking Phoenix, Arizona. I'm talking Seattle, Washington.
Storytelling is a value delivery mechanism. I spent so long telling folks in business that what they say is a story isn't often a story. It's like, okay, that's a strategy, or okay, that's a plan, or okay, that's a messaging. That's not a story. It needs a hero, it needs transformation, right? Those types of things. The opposite is also true. And that is, a story is not a story if it doesn't have something worth remembering, if it doesn't have a fact, if it doesn't have a learning.
Matthew Woodget began his storytelling career in 2012 when Microsoft Dynamics headhunted him to become their Chief Storytelling Officer. He was excited about the opportunity, but quickly learned that business storytelling was still in its infancy, and he had very few proven story structures to turn to. So he began creating his own frameworks. He loves to use metaphors like Story API because he says metaphors are a shortcut to meaning. Matthew studies the intersection of story structure and brain structure and shares with you his T.R.I.P.S, T.R.I.P.S framework he uses for product marketing with his firm Go Narrative, where he helps marketers and entrepreneurs reduce frustration, increase reach, and drive growth using story structures. Matthew is an accomplished filmmaker, photographer, diarist, blogger, and science fiction author. So please welcome to this all-new edition of the Business of Story, coming to you from Northern Arizona, Matthew Woodget. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Park. It's absolutely wonderful to be here, and thanks for everybody for tuning in as well.
You are actually a beta guest for me because I am coming to you from my brand new studio in my brand new home in northern Arizona. And we are rural on a little lake up here, still trying to figure out the Wi-Fi. So this will be kind of interesting to see what happens here. And I appreciate you being my beta tester for this first round. So welcome.
Thank you. And life is nothing if not a daring adventure. Gosh, who said that quote? So we're on our daring adventure today, exploring the wilds of rural northern Arizona and Wi-Fi.
I think that was Helen Keller. Life is a daring adventure or nothing, as I recall.
Yes, yes, it was Helen Keller. You're correct.
Ding, 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 ding. Well, it's a pleasure having you here. You are coming from West Seattle, my old neck of the woods, Seattle area. And we got introduced through the Y Institute and some of the work you're doing there. And you and I chatted about a month or so ago before my big move. And I was fascinated about your work and your background of working at Microsoft Dynamics as their chief storyteller, and then how you moved on from there and the work you're doing today. So, and you talk about Story API, which I'm really interested in. I've never heard it put that way before. So I would love to hear more about that. Let's start, though, Matthew, with your backstory. How did you get into this crazy world of storytelling in the first place?
I kind of got into this crazy world of storytelling like I got into everything in life. I kind of blundered through and into it. I've always been curious, and I've always challenged the status quo, which incidentally, my why is the challenge of status quo and to think different. And I actually was more interested as a youngster in pursuing science. And in fact, I was a massive geek for dinosaurs, for astronomy, to the point where I actually wanted to be an astrophysicist when I was at high school. But I failed physics in high school and was faced with the realization as I was going to university to do physics that it might not be the path for me. And that led me with a passion and an interest in technology. My father grew up. I grew up, rather, I should say, with my father working at Intel. So I was cutting my fingers on daughter boards before I could ride a bike. And I ended up realizing that the opportunity around a career path in technology was something that maybe had a bit more opportunity for me rather than physics. Because as my friend Peter Wang, the CEO of Anaconda, said, unfortunately, the way the education system is set up around science is it's not really where the heart and soul of science came from, which was all about inquiry. And it really got codified into very mathematics heavy. And being a dyslexic and having ADHD, that really became a glass ceiling for me, which sent me off from physics into a right-hand turn into technology. But I also found that I wasn't really a very good programmer. The folks programming on the left of me and the right of me were doing much better there. But then I also realized there was this whole other part of business, which was the business and marketing side of business. And I found that I was actually a little bit better than the programmers in that respect. So that's where I kind of started off on this journey, which led me to Intel and Microsoft. And then I just loved Intel's embracement of crossing the chasm, right? That concept from Jeffrey Moore. You've got the big difference between early adopters and the early majority. And I really fashioned most of my career around that. And it was through that I recognized storytelling as being a key component of crossing the chasm. And as soon as I realized that, and combined it with my own personal passions with storytelling, having written, but not published, 2 science fiction novels, that really was where this whole storytelling and business journey started for me.
And Matthew, can you take us to that moment where you had the aha that said, there is something to this storytelling, especially in the whole crossing the chasm sort of concept?
Absolutely. It goes back to what you mentioned a few minutes ago about the Story API, which in itself is a metaphor, right? And I'm a huge fan of metaphors because they represent our desire to simplify and understand things, right? This idea of meaning, of being understood. It's like if we can't be understood, then there's really no way of moving forward from that. And whilst storytelling is a value problem or a solution to a value problem, right? Where are the poison berries? We should talk about cavemen, by the way. I got into it with a bunch of archaeologists on Twitter about human history and how you and I, as storytellers, shouldn't be saying cavemen, but we can get to that in a second. But it's about that value problem. Where are the poison berries? Where is the shelter? Where is the water? And so it's this kind of combination of understanding and meaning on the one hand and value on the other. And that's why I just am such a massive fan of metaphors, because they're these little shortcuts to meaning. And it was really that realization that we had this opportunity to help the early majority understand and draw the meaning and therefore get value out of what these technology companies were doing in a way that was so different to how we communicated with the early adopters, let alone the innovators who are in it just for the technology's sake itself. And so that for me became this kind of realization that there was something there, and in Park, it's been a slippery slope ever since then.
So how do you define Story API? Now, I'm assuming API, what does that acronym stand for? I know you use an API to help software products and online services connect. Are you using it the same way with Story API?
I am, and I probably should even upgrade. There's another metaphor. I should probably upgrade my usage of Story API to something a little bit more prescient, right? An example that many folks may understand is that of Zapier, right? With the explosion of cloud services, it's like, how do you get these different cloud services talking to each other? How do you get your newsletter system talking to your CRM system, talking to your ERP system if you're not buying it all from one vendor? And so it's really, API stands for Application Programming Interface. My geek's showing there, right? My computer science degree, but it's really about having two systems or two sets of software communicate with each other and transfer value, right? To transfer factors, to transfer any type of information at all. That's really what the API is about. And again, with Zapier, right, you can do that with different apps, right? We use it in our business. And so it's about that, it's the ability for these different systems to communicate together. And what are we as human beings? We're a bunch of these little brains and these little skulls, and we're trying to interact with each other. And having spent time with some gorillas, actually in the in the mist, if you will, in Rwanda, and seeing how the silverback would communicate to his tribe and to us, quite frankly, to lay down the law. That's communicating something to us, right? But it's very primitive. It's very rudimentary. What we as humans have managed to do is we've managed to take that to a whole nother level, to transfer vast and complicated ideas between each other. And I see storytelling as being the vehicle for doing that.
So the story is the API that connects human beings together and transfers that meaning. It's your metaphor. But when was it, though, you being a tech guy working at Intel and so forth, that this hit you upside the head? That maybe no one had taught you about using story, but you're using it now. And when you saw it in action and you said, there's something to this.
Exactly. And it was in fact, I was offered this role of Chief Storyteller for Microsoft Dynamics. And it was because the hiring manager had been a previous GM of mine, and he knew that I was a passionate storyteller. He knew that I'd written 2 science fiction novels. He knew that I enjoyed crafting presentations and working with our sales teams to help the product marketing teams, get the message across both to the partners and to the market. And so I was actually tapped for this opportunity. So I didn't actually go out and look for it, but it was a good fit. And when the first day I sat down, I thought, wow, this is going to be, maybe easy is not the right word, but here we go. This is going to be one of the best jobs I've ever had. And I'm going to be able to apply all this passion to it. And I'm going to go out, I'm going to find some good frameworks, right? Because why reinvent the wheel? An old mentor, Nick, once told me, never reinvent the wheel if you can find one that's already been invented. And so I immediately went out and started looking for frameworks that I could apply and bring into the business. And I was really struck at how there was nothing, I couldn't find anything for business. You hadn't written brand Barritchery by that point or at that point. And I found all the Hollywood work, all the hero's journey, and it was fascinating, but I really struggled to find a way to apply that to the business. And so I took on this role as a story interpreter to kind of hold on to the engine with one hand and the caboose, the engine of the business on one hand and the caboose of storytelling on the other, and bring those together in a way that could be used by the business.
And what year was this?
It was 2012. So that was when this journey started for me in earnest.
So Microsoft Dynamics, a division, I guess, of Microsoft, what did they do and why did they decide that they wanted to get into storytelling?
So Microsoft Dynamics is a division at Microsoft. It's now a part of the cloud and enterprise business. But Dynamics is all about business software. And what I mean by that is the software that runs parts of the business, not the productivity software, not the Microsoft Office or the Microsoft Word, but the software used for enterprise resource planning, for running factories, the CRM systems for running customer relationships. And Microsoft Dynamics was competing and still does compete very heavily with SAP. They're also partners, right? This competition that exists in the market in many ways. But they really recognized that they weren't going to win on feature comparisons, right? There's this moment where most businesses that are in a competitive situation realize that you can only differentiate so far. And you can have the most differentiated and the best product in the world, but if somebody else is already locked into the idea of something else, then you have to find a different way to change their minds on that, to communicate not just your value, but to get that meaning and that understanding. And SAP were and still are a behemoth of enterprise resource planning in particular. And in fact, to the point where there was a book written called SAP Nation about the fact that you effectively have, and I can't remember the exact numbers on this, not being a numbers guy myself, thanks dyslexia, but it's really about that, when you the size of a nation, right? The number of people and the amount of money that's involved. And so Microsoft was going against that, and they recognized that just going head to head on capabilities, on features, no matter how good those features were, that they just weren't going to break through. And so that was the impetus for bringing storytelling in. And they luckily had some super executives who really recognized and embraced that fact. And luckily, one of those executives was a previous GM of mine, which led me to be brought in to be a part of the team working on solving that.
So what was some of the work that you did to initially bring storytelling in and start training it and having it applied in their sales and their marketing?
Yeah, for me, Park, it was really very much coming from that crossing the chasm perspective. I came in with really those two key priorities that I had. Number one was we really need to think outside in. Right, we need to think from the customer's perspective, and that aligned closely with the organization's need and recognized need of focusing on personas. And we'll get back to that in a second. And then the second aspect for me was the concept of the decision-making journey, right, which is so closely aligned to the chasm. Because if you can't get somebody to decide for you, then you're never going to cross the chasm. And so I came into it. In fact, the first efforts I had were all in that space. They were about how can we do a better job of understanding the personas, documenting the personas, and how can we think more holistically about this customer decision-making journey and how to make sure that we're creating the right content. And this was actually, the product marketing organization was, my big internal client there, and it was really helping that organization understand how we could help our customers or potential customers navigate that journey. But the personas was that I made some big mistakes in approaching personas there, which I've since rectified. But personas was one of the first priorities that we had, is really understanding the customer from a not just a brain perspective, a head perspective, but also from a heart perspective.
So what were the mistakes you made that we can learn from so we don't do the same mistakes?
That's a great question. One of the biggest mistakes anybody can make with personas, and I know this because I did this, is in the pursuit of getting more focused on the outside in, on breaking the chains of products and of features and of roles and of priorities around roles, it's easy to go too far. And we did that. We went too far, and I ended up spending too much time and energy on things like what type of car does the CFO of a business drive, right? Like it was these descriptions around who these personas were that I thought were going to bring some heart into the equation, and what I didn't realize at the time was what I was doing was I was just actually confusing things even more, because it raised more questions about, why does this matter and how does this affect how we market to these folks? And since then, I've realized that the way that we get to heart is really about the emotional experience that people have as they go through this process. And in fact, I was last night we were running a workshop with a client in Australia, so that was fun because it was in the middle of the night, and we're really digging down into the transformation that is happening within a society, within organizations, and within individuals. And when you focus on that in a persona, when you focus on the transformation that CFO has to go through, the pressures that they're under, the stresses that they're under, there's a whole universe of that just within their career. You don't have to worry about the fact that CFO might be driving a Mercedes. And so that's a lesson that I learned along the way.
Well, stories are always about a moment, and moment is derived from the Latin word for momentum, motion. So it only makes sense when you're thinking about a customer persona, instead of figuring out how they ornament their lives and what they eat and what they drink and what they drive and what kind of dog they have, it's like, who cares? You want to really dive in and think about, what do they experience? What do they fear? What is exhausting them? What is frustrating them? What is confusing them? What are they optimistic about? And finding the answers to those so that you know what stories to tell them, so that they can visualize something that, at Microsoft Dynamics, that you can help them get through and keep them from waking up at 2:30 in the morning, or help them overcome that malaise, that management malaise they have, because you have a specific offering that can solve that problem for them. And we don't really even care. It makes no sense what kind of car they drive, right? And I only bring that up, Matthew, because in my younger days, 35 years ago, when I got into branding, marketing, advertising, when we would do branding, I was taught the most ludicrous approach. And even back then, I had no idea what the hell. Why were we doing it this way? But I thought they must know better than me. And it came down to, you get the typical, demographics, age, race, female, male, whatever. But then it would be in, like, if you were, what kind of car would they drive? Or if they were a magazine, what kind of magazines do they read? And it just seemed like madness to me, because it didn't really identify what was going on between their ears and what they were experiencing in life. And I think you hit it on the head there through your own revelation at Microsoft Dynamics, that you've got to understand how they experience life, where they are on their journey, so you know what story to tell them, so that they can picture a brighter future, a better outcome, something that they can do tomorrow by acting today with you.
Exactly. It's really about that contrast. One of the things that I found that happened to me as I started to look for frameworks, and I geeked out on the hero's journey, on Vogler's work, on the Pixar work, and I had to be this interpreter because there was no business of stories. There was no brand butchery at the time. In fact, I was thinking about this, like, what would have happened if I could have read Park's book back then? What kind of path would I gone on? But what really happened for me was I found myself starting to realize this, what you just said, which is it's about these moments. It's about moving people to act. That's very much about what companies have to think about. It's about the customer journey. And I love the fact that you mentioned, the kind of the female male example, the magazine, example, my failure with cars, right? Literally, that was one, the CFO, and it was a Mercedes. I will never forget that. I even remember the chart that we had, the board we had, and we had it all pinned up on. But what I realized was happening, and this is exactly what you were just describing as well, is an over-reliance on metaphors. Like, metaphors are very useful. Metaphors have a shelf life. And some, there's always exceptions to the rule, but in general, metaphors do have a shelf life, and they get to the point where they become a crutch. They become a cheat rather than a hack. And when they become a cheat and everybody's using them, they actually start to lose meaning. And that's exactly the type of thing that happens when you think about, okay, so we need to care about this person's what is moving this person, and then it's very easy to then slip out into these things that don't matter. Whereas the irony of this whole concept is going back to crossing the chasm, going back to the customer journey, going back to these very fundamental business aspects are actually what helped me reframe how I was thinking about storytelling in a way that was as a practical tool for business. And that was the big big thing that I was wrestling with and struggling with at the time, which was, how do I take Kurt Vonnegut's teachings and turn them into something I can use inside this business? And the more and more I dug into that hole and explored it, two things happened. One is I learned an enormous amount about how our brains tick, which I'm still learning today, and how society ticks. And I just read Will Storr's book, The Science of Storytelling, which is absolutely wonderful as well. And the second thing was, I became inspired by the opportunity beyond what I was doing at the time. And it was that at that moment I had the desire within that first 12 months to set up my own company doing this for more than just Microsoft, because I recognize the opportunity in so many companies. But it took a tragic life experience to really light a fire under me to actually go and do that.
Well, what happened?
In 2015, I got the phone call that nobody wants to get, especially an expat who is 10 hours away from their family, and that was that there'd been a car crash. And my father had been killed instantly, and by the time the plane landed in the UK, my mother had also died. And that for me became this, not only was it just an absolutely earth-shattering experience, life-shattering experience, which so many people are going through as well with COVID around the world today. And anybody who ever goes through that, it's just absolutely tragic. And by the way, as a total side note, I'm involved with the Virginia Mason Traumatic Loss Clinic here in Seattle, and we do sort of a quarterly Zoom therapy session at scale, with which I'm one of the panelists. And so if anybody who's listening to the show has lost a loved one, or has a friend who's lost a loved one, you can reach out to me and I'll help get you connected to that resource. But it's tragic. It's something that just completely changes your world. And not only is it very difficult to deal with, but it left me with this realization that I don't have a lot of time, right? My father had literally just retired that spring, and within 6 months he was dead. All this, all this savings he had, all these plans he had, he couldn't take any of it with him, and he couldn't do any of it. And the same, obviously, with my mother, as a very close-knit relationship that they had. And so it really lit a fire under me to say, Matthew, you've been thinking about doing this thing. It's time to actually just take the risk, go out there, push the envelope, and see what happens.
So you left Microsoft and you started Go Narrative?
I spent a year, had a great opportunity. A friend was left an agency that he had formed and was forming another agency. And I had the opportunity to help him do that and learn the ropes of running a boutique agency. And so I did that for a year, helped them get that going. And then after that year, formed Go Narrative.
And so what are you doing now? What is Go Narrative, and how are you helping businesses out there?
So we help marketers and entrepreneurs reduce frustration so that they can increase their reach and drive growth. And really what that boils down to is helping our clients. And you and I have talked about this before, which is that, I love Mexican food, and there's lots of Mexican restaurants, right? So you and I are very much in a similar space here. But my background with product marketing has found us doing a lot of work with product marketers. We've also found that every company is a technology company nowadays, and there's a lot of actually in finance. There's a lot of businesses in finance as well, which are having to deploy interesting technology solutions. In fact, the client that we were working with the workshop for the last 2 nights, they're in a global accounting firm, and we're helping them build out their narrative for one of their solution areas. And so it's very much about helping our clients connect with the meaning and the movement they want to drive within their customers, so that they can actually have a positive forward motion in their customer journey for their customers, and ultimately grow their business.
So how do you do that? How do you coach stories that some of our listeners could take away and use some of your techniques on their own work?
So we have a couple of methodologies. It's funny, you start going into this, and as you've experienced, and you've obviously come up with the story cycle system, which I love, which is brilliant, and I love how you've taken the hero's journey and applied it to business in that way.
Oh, thank you.
We absolutely. And when I looked at the hero's journey, and I'll use that as a proxy, right, for all of those frameworks. I always found it really fascinating, and wanted to figure out how I could apply that to business, and love the fact that you've done that to apply that directly to business. But for me, I also wasn't satisfied with just understanding how to apply the hero's journey storytelling structure, and I didn't know why. There was something that was kind of in the back of my head that was kind of an itch I couldn't quite scratch. And as I dug deeper and deeper and deeper into it, I realized what that was, and it was because of my it's the same thing that led me to being fascinated with dinosaurs and then with astrophysics and resulted in those two science fiction novels that I'd written, was this fascination with the science of things. And part of this was probably because my father was an engineer and my mother was a microzoologist, virologist. And so they raised us. In fact, they said you should get an engineering degree or a maths degree because then you can go and do anything. It turned out my unique blend of ADHD and dyslexia threw up some interesting roadblocks for myself. But so what I found, Park, was I wanted to understand the mechanics a bit more. And so I dug deeper and I started to kind of geek out on the brain science and the limbic brain. And that's, by the way, one of the things I loved about the connection to the Y Institute is this focus on the limbic brain and the ability to shortcut through the cerebral cortex and the logical part of the brain into the emotional center, and then back out through the neocortex with the structures that allows, which is where storytelling structures actually can get formed and communicated. But to think of that whole holistic view of the brain on the one hand, and then on society on the other hand. And in fact, whilst I really enjoyed Lisa Cron's book, with the title of that
Wired for Story.
Wired for Story. That's it. Wired for Story. Love that book. Will Storr went even further for me into those fundamentals and those basics recently. And so I'm reading continually over the past 8 years, have read every possible book I could get my hands on this space. And on the science side as well, exploring with the brain science. And so for me, what happened because of that? Well, I developed this framework called the T.R.I.P.S storytelling methodology, and it's transformational, reasons to believe, innovation, problems, and stories. And so this is our fundamental framework. And then we dive deep into the story section. We've got a structure we call the 3D structure that allows you to see your story from every angle. And then our meet your customers where they are structure, which is morals, essential emotions, and truths, which actually came out of the COVID crisis, which helps anchor emotions into those stories. So it starts with T.R.I.P.S at the big narrative, high level umbrella, dives down into the stories, because as you and I know, narratives are a collection of stories, and then the emotions in those stories. But T.R.I.P.S is where it all starts. And those 5 letters are super important. So transformation, it's about that movement. It's about why should somebody care, right? It's like you move out of the road because the car's coming, right? And Will Storr talks about the contrast, how our brains are wired for contrast and looking for contrast, light and dark, loud and quiet, and so on. And so what is happening in the world that is worth even caring about, and that's what this transformation element is all about. The reasons to believe is kind of like the science or the education. It's like educate yourself, right? There's this thing happening, but why is it happening? What are the facts? What are the trends? What are the reasons, right? What is the rational aspect to this? Because storytelling is a value delivery mechanism. I spent so long telling folks in business that what they say is a story isn't often a story. It's like, okay, that's a strategy, or okay, that's a plan, or okay, that's some messaging. That's not a story. It needs a hero. It needs transformation, right? Those types of things. The opposite is also true. And that is, a story is not a story if it doesn't have something worth remembering, if it doesn't have a fact, if it doesn't have a learning. And so that's what the reasons to believe is about. It's about those elements. And then I is innovation. That's the lightning rod of your brand. It's why you, right? This could be a product differentiation. It could be a cultural aspect. It could be your CEO. It could be the charismatic CEO. It could something, whatever that lightning rod for your brand is, the innovation, the thing that's special about your brand. And again, as you and I and anybody who's ever tried to get something they want, from a cup of water to a delicious Mexican meal to deploying a cloud solution, there's always things that stand in the way. And that's the problems. And the problems start at the very beginning, getting going. They crop up along the way, all the way to the end. And navigating and understanding those problems is essential to success. And so if a company doesn't understand what those problems are for its clients, it's never going to truly be able to help them. And the S is stories. It's customer stories, where we always encourage our clients to start with, do you have a customer story that you can take somebody through some social proof to demonstrate that? But then it goes beyond that. It's the metaphors, like Story API, right? the fact we talk about hacking something, right? Even if we're not coding. And so it's all of the parts of story, and that's what the TRIPS methodology is.
So, Matthew, I missed something here. We've got T for transformation, R is reason to believe, I is innovation. What is P?
P is problems. P is the problems that crop up along the way.
Okay, so this is the problems that you are solving on behalf of your customers and getting really focused on what those problems are. So you know how to story to them, to share with them how you're going to help them overcome.
Exactly. And and helping our clients put their outside in hat on. Really, my mother used to say, you should never criticize somebody until you've walked a mile in their shoes. And then my father would chime in and say, because then you're a mile away and you're in their shoes. But it's really about understanding what the person's dealing with, the client, the customer, the audience.
Oh, yeah, that's an old Jack Handy quote. I love that one. Remember him from Saturday Night Live? I love that one. So you use this TRIPS as kind of a strategic framework to help you get the content you need identified, and then it lands on stories at the end. And now you got to actually tell these stories. And it's not about your features and functions, but it's about the real world impact you make in your customers' lives, correct?
Exactly.
So that's pretty fascinating. And this is what you've been doing at Go Narrative. And do you work primarily on the product side in the B2B world, versus services?
Most of our business is in the business to business world, and less so in the B2C. There's some B2C projects that we've worked on. But for me, it's really the B2B. There's so much opportunity to help product marketers in particular, all the way up through the organization, all the way up to the VPs of product marketing who are trying to figure out how do we take these amazing complex products and take them to market. And product marketing serves this really, really important bridge between that world and the marketing world. And so we find ourselves helping a lot of product marketers because the curse of knowledge is strong within product marketing, and recognizing that you have a curse of knowledge there, and taking an outside-in focus beyond solution benefit conversations, which every product marketer can do, is super, super important.
So what are a couple, 3 things right now that our listeners can take away from this conversation that they can start doing immediately to become better storytellers in their B2B world?
Well, I think one is this outside in. It's like you really need to think about what your audience is dealing with, because that's not only is that the beginning of understanding things like transformation and how you position to that, but it's also where you start to unlock empathy. And if empathy, I like to look at empathy as being like the gateway emotion for business. There's the gateway drug. There's another metaphor right there. And so outside in is very, very important. The second thing I would say is it's go beyond the data. Right. There's a lot of stats in business, so damn lies and statistics. We've all heard that saying, right? And so going beyond the data on the one hand, by bringing story in, but also not losing sight of the fact that you do need to be delivering some data, right? Stories are a vehicle for delivering data. So look at that yin yang, make sure you go beyond the data. And if you keep that outside in focus, that'll help you get that yin yang balance right. And then I'd really I'd say start with metaphors. Metaphors are a really, really powerful way to start playing with stories and with narrative. When we look at how I think it's for every 11 seconds of language, there's one metaphor, and that was actually Will Storr cites the science behind that in his book. And so metaphors are in Russell Brunson in .com Secrets, he talks about saying it's like ... right? So it's like. So that's a really good place to start. Say it's like, and then that's a good starting point to start thinking about metaphors. And then once you start to thinking about metaphors, you can then start to think about how your business and your strategy and your business's narrative can be represented in metaphors. And if you go through the sort of the structuring of the narrative frameworks, if you go through the brand bewitchery and the utilizing of the story cycle, when you do these things in the context of of outside in, of getting that balance right between the data and the story. And you also then make sure that you're thinking about how you say it's like. You're going to set yourself up for some very powerful narrative metaphors that are going to help the market rapidly understand who you are and how you can help. Because at the end of the day, if nobody understands us, then they're never going to buy from us.
And to bring this idea of metaphor full circle, when you were talking about creating those customer personas, you don't necessarily want to think too much in metaphor there. You just want to get right down to the brass tacks of who are these people, what are they experiencing, what are they going through, and get as super real about that as possible. However, you put your metaphor cap on when you now have to create real meaning in their world. So if you are just leading with features and functions, it could be so boring, they're going to tune you out. And especially if you're leading with data and numbers, they are going to tune you out. But if you use story and metaphor to create an interesting context or meaning around it, to get them to look at it in a way they had never thought about before, that creates that real aha moment. That's where metaphor can be invaluable in your business.
Absolutely, and I love your numbers metaphor there. I thought that was funny. You're great with metaphors, not surprisingly. I loved how you talk about the one true superpower in your book. For example, it's brilliant. Absolutely, it's about getting that shared understanding and it's hand in glove. Here's a recommendation I'd give anybody who's listening. Go watch Cosmos. If you, by all means, read the book. That was a huge influence to me as a teenager. But the Cosmos TV show, which is available, the second one just got released on Nat Geo on Disney Plus, and it's wonderful because of the storytelling and the science. It is a really good example of how these two aspects go hand in glove. How understanding the world and how it ticks, and all the data and all the rational aspects get understood when they're told through stories. And if you can do that with science, with something like Cosmos, just think about the opportunity for your business and engaging your audience.
One final thought on that. You were talking about the hero's journey, and Christopher Vogler, who wrote the amazing book, The Writer's Journey. And when I was studying Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, I did map it to business because I felt like, and you hear this with other companies, is like, oh, we are going to use the Pixar way for our marketing. And I don't think it works very well. At least I haven't heard a lot of great outcomes, because if you don't cross that chasm from being a screenwriter or, using these story structures that Hollywood and novelists have used and try to just automatically overlay them in business, it just doesn't work, because you're not a Pixar quality screenwriter. They're giving you the frameworks and whatever, but you have to map them to business. What does this mean when the call to adventure in Star Wars? Well, what does that look like in your customer's life? And let's think about, to your point, empathizing with them, understanding what they're going through, and what is that little call to adventure that we want to make happen that will get them to buy into our world and into our story. So I have found that time and time again, and you maybe experienced that a little bit, Matthew, when you started at Microsoft, where you didn't have the frameworks first because they were all basically like Hollywood-based and novelist-based, and probably were very helpful for you in the writing of your two nonfiction books. But when it comes to business, you got to absolutely put on your business cap and think about, okay, how can I use this structure or framework for what I'm trying to sell, what I'm trying to get people to believe in? And it is a different thing. You have to cross that chasm from Hollywood into Main Street business. And that's what we try to do with Brand Bewitchery and with the Story Cycle System and a couple of the other frameworks that we teach in there. And it sounds like it's exactly what you're doing at Go Narrative.
I love how you just described that, because that's exactly the problem. The chasm between the innovators and early adopters of storytelling, that is the entire history of literature, theater, movies, you name it. That industry is the innovators and the early adopters, and they're experts. And that the Geoffrey Moore's chasm is very explicit in saying that the early majority do not reference against early adopters. They reference against each other. So they look to each other. So the majority looks to each other. A really famous example here is the iPod, right? Is Steve Jobs in the 5,000 songs in your pocket. That moment when he stood up on stage and said that crossed the chasm for MP3 players into the early majority. At that time, I was in the early majority, possibly even innovators. I had a creative Zen jukebox with twice as many songs on it as the first iPods, but it was a manual process. You had to you had to understand PCs and software and how to take your CDs and turn them to MP3 so you could put them on this device. And Steve Jobs crossed the chasm into the mainstream and also made it easy, of course. It's a big part of it. And it's the same with storytelling. And that's what I love about your book, is it's actually found a way to cross the chasm for the hero's journey and to get it into a place where people can understand it. And yes, you and I do very, very similar things helping our clients do this. It's like we recognize this magical lightning rod of power in storytelling, which has got this whole world history, right, of proof. And it's how do we help businesses leverage that and utilize that so that they can have the success that they're seeking.
Well, Matthew, thank you so much for being here. This has been just a great pleasure speaking with you today in my all-new studio up here in Northern Arizona, and I just really appreciate you taking the time.
And Park, thank you so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. And also thank you so much for everybody for listening as well.
And I'd like to second that. Thank you for tuning in again to another edition of The Business of Story. If I can be of service to you, you know where to track me down over at businessofstory.com. If you liked what you heard today, feel free to share this show out and about. Get your book, Brand Bewitchery, and start going through and applying these different frameworks in your world. And take a look at Go Narrative and some of the work that they're doing over there and how you can be using some of Matthew's frameworks to really get your head wrapped around how to use metaphor and how to use story to create real meaning around your product or service, especially in the B2B world. Because as you all know, in the B2B world, we tend to lead with logic, reason, and being rational, thinking we're selling to businesses. But that's the biggest fallacy out there. We are not selling to businesses. We are selling to people, to fellow Homo sapiens. And you know the old adage, people don't buy from businesses, they buy from people. And that's why this is such a powerful market. And storytelling is one of the most powerful yet underutilized skills in your B2B world. So Matthew and I are here to help you in any way we can to really rise above the noise and hook into the hearts of your audiences through the power of storytelling. I hope you'll join us next week when we will have another amazing story artist right here for you, like Matthew. And until then, remember that the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thanks so much for listening.